Liam woke to the sound of silence. Too much silence. His sleepy town of Willow Creek always buzzed faintly in the mornings, the distant hum of radios, the chatter of neighbors. But today, an eerie stillness hung over the air, thick and oppressive. Pulling on a sweater, he stepped outside. That's when he saw it. A single red balloon bobbed gently in the breeze, tied to the fence of his next-door neighbor's yard. It shouldn't have been there. Mrs. Higgins, the sweet old woman who lived there, didn't have grandchildren or parties, and yet the balloon swayed, its vibrant crimson stark against the pale autumn sky. The unease in Liam's chest deepened when he noticed something else. The front door of Mrs. Higgins's house was ajar. By the time the police arrived, the quiet had been replaced by chaos. Detectives swarmed the scene. Yellow tape stretched across the yard. The rumors spread fast. Mrs. Higgins had been found inside, brutally murdered. Liam watched it all from his porch, clutching a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. His eyes kept drifting back to the balloon, now fluttering in the wind as if mocking the grim reality. Later that night, Liam tried to shake the unease gnawing at him. He couldn't explain why that balloon unnerved him so deeply. It was just a balloon, wasn't it? He turned on the TV to distract himself, flipping through channels absent-mindedly. But his attention snapped back when a breaking news report flashed on the screen. Police report a disturbing discovery at the scene of the murder. A single red balloon was found tied to the fence. Authorities are investigating whether this could be a clue left by the killer. The anchor's voice faded into static in Liam's ears. He didn't hear the rest of the report. All he could think about was how strange the balloon had looked earlier, almost alive. The next day, another red balloon appeared. This time it was tied to the gate of Willow Creek Park. And by the afternoon, another murder was reported. A jogger found near the pond. The balloon floated lazily nearby, its string barely grazing the water's surface. The town was gripped by fear. Liam overheard whispers at the diner, hushed conversations about the killer. But no one dared speak too loudly, as if acknowledging the balloons might summon them. By the third night, Liam had almost convinced himself it was a coincidence. A twisted joke, maybe, until he found the note. It was tied to a red balloon floating outside his own front door. His blood ran cold as he plucked the note from the string, unfolding it with trembling hands. "Remember what you did." The words were scrawled in thick, smeared ink, the letters jagged and angry. His chest tightened as he stared at the message, a distant memory tugging at the edges of his mind, a memory he had long buried. Shaking, Liam retreated into his house, locking the door behind him. He sat at the kitchen table, the note and the balloon string beside him. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He knew this wasn't random. The balloons, the murders, the note, they were all connected. And somehow, it was tied to him. That night, Liam dreamed of his childhood, of laughter and screams, of a girl's face he couldn't quite remember. When he woke in a cold sweat, he found his old journal on the floor next to his bed. He didn't remember taking it out. The leather cover was damp, the pages inside streaked with a deep red ink. One phrase repeated over and over across the pages. "You can't hide from the past." Liam staring into the darkness of his room, the faint sound of a child's giggle echoing through the night. Liam hadn't slept. The journal sat open on his kitchen table, its red-streaked pages illuminated by the weak morning light. He stared at the repeated phrase, "You can't hide from the past." It pulsed in his mind like a heartbeat. The town was in panic. Another murder had been discovered overnight. A shopkeeper downtown. The police were scrambling, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every victim had a red balloon nearby. And now, one of those balloons had been at Liam's door. He tried to distract himself, flipping through the news on his phone. Headlines screamed of a killer on the loose, but no one had answers. The balloons, though, they were always mentioned. The press called them the calling cards. Liam's stomach churned. He wasn't just scared, he felt guilty. Determined to find clarity, Liam visited his childhood friend Owen. They hadn't spoken in years. But if anyone could help him piece together the fragments of his past, it was Owen. Owen's house was on the edge of town, a dilapidated structure that seemed to shrink under the weight of its own history. When Liam knocked, it took a full minute before the door creaked open. Owen stood there, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He didn't look surprised to see Liam. "I was wondering when you'd come," Owen muttered, stepping aside to let him in. The inside of the house was worse than the outside, cluttered, dusty, and dark. Liam followed Owen to the living room, where a single lamp cast a feeble glow. "You've seen the balloons," Owen said flatly, not bothering with pleasantries. Liam nodded. "You have too, haven't you?" Owen's laugh was dry and humorless. "Seen them? They've been haunting me for years." He slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. "I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But now, they're real." Liam leaned forward, his pulse racing. "What do they want? What's happening, Owen?" Owen looked up, his eyes glistening with something between fear and regret. "You don't remember, do you?" Owen's words pulled at a thread in Liam's memory, unraveling snippets of a childhood summer long buried. They'd been kids, running wild through the town, carefree and untouchable. There was a girl, Emily, quiet, shy, always tagging along though no one had really invited her. One day they dared Emily to go into the old carnival grounds, long abandoned and rumored to be haunted. The challenge had seemed harmless at the time, just a silly game, but something had gone horribly wrong. Emily never came out. The police had searched for weeks, but no trace of her was ever found. Eventually, the town moved on, and so did Liam. Until now. Owen's voice pulled Liam back to the present. "It's her, Liam. Emily. The balloons. They're her way of coming back." "That's impossible," Liam snapped, though his voice wavered. She's gone." Owen shook his head. "You think death would stop her?" "Not after what we did." Liam wanted to argue, to deny it, but his mind was flooded with images of Emily's face. The way she'd looked back at him that day, eyes wide with fear as they dared her to go into the carnival. "Why now?" Liam whispered. Owen hesitated, his gaze darting to the window. "Because we've ignored it for too long. The guilt, it festers, and she feeds on it." As Liam left Owen's house, his mind churned with unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. The streets were eerily empty, the air too still. When he reached his house, another red balloon was waiting for him, tied to the handle of his mailbox. He didn't approach it right away. His hands shook as he finally untied the string and found another note attached. This time, it wasn't a cryptic message. It was a photograph. The faded picture showed a group of kids, him, Owen, and their childhood friends. In the background, barely visible, was Emily standing near the entrance of the carnival. But her face wasn't shy or afraid. It was furious. Her eyes seemed to burn right through the photograph, locking onto Liam. A chill ran down his spine as he flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back in red ink were the words, "You led me there." That night, Liam dreamed of the carnival. The broken rides, the peeling paint, the hollow echo of distant laughter. He saw Emily walking ahead of him, her small figure disappearing into the shadows. In the dream, he tried to call out to her, to stop her, but no sound came from his mouth. When he woke, his throat was raw as though he'd been screaming, and there, floating at the foot of his bed, was a red balloon. The balloon drifting closer, its string reaching out like a hand. Liam's voice cracks as he whispers, "Emily." The balloon pops. Darkness. Liam sat on the floor, staring at the shredded remains of the red balloon. The silence of his room felt heavier than ever, suffocating. He clutched the photo of Emily, her burning gaze haunting him even now. "You led me there." The words echoed in his mind, louder than his own heartbeat. The guilt was unbearable, and the weight of it pressed down on his chest like an invisible hand. Emily wasn't just a memory. She was here, and she wanted vengeance. But why now? What had triggered her return? The answer came to him suddenly. The carnival. Willow Creek's abandoned carnival had always been a ghost story, a relic of a darker time. After Emily's disappearance, the town had locked its gates, letting it rot. But Liam remembered something else. It was being torn down next week, a decision announced only recently. The thought chilled him. Was Emily trying to stop it? Or was the carnival her tether, the only thing keeping her tied to this world? Either way, Liam knew what he had to do. He couldn't run anymore. He had to face her, to confront the past he'd tried so hard to forget. He grabbed his coat, shoved the photo into his pocket, and drove into the night. The carnival loomed ahead, its rusted gates barely holding together under the weight of years. The air felt colder here, sharper, and every step Liam took felt heavier, like the ground itself was resisting him. As he entered, the memories hit him like a flood. The smell of popcorn and sawdust, the flickering lights of the Ferris wheel, the sound of Emily's laughter as she tried to keep up with the group. And then the darkness. Liam followed the path they'd taken that day, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. The balloons were waiting for him, dozens of them scattered throughout the carnival grounds. They floated silently, their strings brushing the ground like they were alive. Each balloon seemed to watch him, swaying slightly as if urging him forward. At the center of the carnival, he found her. Emily stood in the middle of the old carousel, her form flickering between solid and shadow. Her dress was torn, her hair wild, and her eyes burned with a hatred that made Liam's knees weak. "You came," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Liam swallowed the lump in his throat. "I had to. I'm sorry, Emily, for everything." Her laughter was sharp and bitter. "Sorry? You think sorry will bring me back?" She stepped closer, her feet not quite touching the ground. "You all left me. You laughed as I screamed. You dared me to go in there." Liam shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "It wasn't supposed to happen. We didn't know. You didn't care." Emily's voice roared, shaking the ground beneath them. The balloons around her began to pop, one by one, the sound like gunshots in the still night. "You pushed me into the dark, Liam, and now I'll show you what it felt like." The world around him twisted. Liam was no longer in the carnival, but in a warped version of it. The colors bleeding into shadows, the rides decayed beyond recognition. The sound of children's laughter twisted into screams, looping endlessly in his ears. Emily loomed over him, her face inches from his. Feel it, the fear, the loneliness, the pain of being forgotten. Liam's breath came in gasps as the memories surged forward, the truth he'd buried for years. They had dared Emily to go into the funhouse, but when she screamed for help, they'd run. They thought she was playing a prank, trying to scare them. He hadn't just ignored her cries, he'd laughed. "I'm sorry," Liam whispered, his voice breaking. "I was scared. I was a coward. I should have helped you, but I didn't. I left you there. I left you alone." Emily paused, her flickering form trembling. The carousel around them slowed, its haunting music fading. For a moment, Liam thought it was over, but Emily's face twisted into something darker. "Sorry isn't enough," she hissed. "You all deserve to suffer like I did." Liam's heart pounded. "Then take me," he said, stepping closer. "If this is about justice, then take me. Leave the others. Just let this end." Emily tilted her head, considering him. The balloons floated upward, their strings wrapping around Liam's arms and legs, pulling him to his knees. "I've waited so long for this," she whispered. The strings tightened, cutting into his skin, but Liam didn't fight. He met her gaze, tears streaming down his face. "I deserve this. I know I do." But then something shifted. Emily's expression softened, her flickering form stabilizing. The balloons around Liam began to pop one by one until only silence remained. "You finally see it," she said quietly. "The truth, the guilt. That's all I wanted." Her form began to fade, her voice growing distant. "Remember me, Liam. Don't let them forget me." And then she was gone. Liam woke up just outside the carnival gates, the morning sun casting long shadows over the broken rides. The red balloons were gone, and the air felt lighter, quieter. But he knew this wasn't over. Emily's memory would never fade completely. As he walked back to his car, he spotted something tied to the door handle. A single red string fluttering in the wind. Liam driving away, the faint sound of a child's laughter echoing in the distance.